Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're tackling one of the biggest, yet often invisible forces shaping our world, a massive, record-breaking wave of global debt. Let's dive right in. So, just how big are we talking? Well, think about this. By 2018, debt in emerging and developing economies had already rocketed to a record 170% of their combined GDP. That's a jump of 54 percentage points in just 8 years. This isn't a slow trickle, it's an absolute fire hose of borrowing. And here's the scary part. This mountain of debt isn't being built on solid ground. As the World Bank points out, it's all happening in a world economy that's getting more and more fragile. We're talking about the slowest global growth we've seen since the 2008 financial crisis. You don't need to be an economist to know that higher debt and slower growth is a really dangerous combination. In fact, according to the World Bank, we've seen this movie before. We've had 3 other big debt waves in the last 50 years. So what makes this one so special? It's the sheer scale of it all. This fourth wave is the largest, the fastest, and the most widespread surge of debt in modern history. To really get our heads around what this means in the real world, let's zoom in on our first case study, China, a nation whose economic miracle, as you'll see, was basically built on a foundation of debt. Now, a huge part of China's story comes down to these things called LGFVs. The simplest way to think of them is like special purpose credit cards for local governments. They let cities get around official borrowing limits and spend, well, big on everything from shiny new airports to entire cities, all while keeping the true scale of that debt conveniently off the official books. So how did this happen? Well, it was really a series of key policy decisions. Back in '94, new rules forced local governments to get creative with borrowing. Then came the 2008 financial crisis, and China opened the floodgates with a massive stimulus, mostly channeled through those LGFDVs. And finally, when Beijing tried to slam on the brakes in 2020, it sent shockwaves through the entire system, exposing just how fragile it all was. And the result of all that? A truly staggering debt-to-GDP ratio of nearly 290%. You can see the main culprits right there: corporate debt and all that hidden local government borrowing. The very thing that was a powerful engine for growth has now become a major drag on the entire economy. Okay, now let's shift gears and look at our second case study, because it tells a completely different story. Scotland's debt challenge isn't about some sudden boom and bust. No, it's about a slow, creeping pressure that's driven by something we all face: demographics. The projections from the Scottish Fiscal Commission are, frankly, pretty stark. You're looking at a growing gap between what the government spends and the money it has coming in. To put it simply, over the next 50 years, the country is on track to spend way more than it brings in. That's a serious long-term challenge to its financial stability. And the reason why is crystal clear. The single biggest pressure on the budget isn't some massive infrastructure project or a banking crisis. It's the rising cost of healthcare for an aging population. And that spending growth is expected to completely swamp any savings they might make in other areas, like education. So, what this really shows us is that the global debt problem has many different faces. On one side, you've got China's high-risk, high-speed development model. And on the other, you have Scotland's long-term promise to provide healthcare in an aging society. These are 2 totally different paths. But you know what? They both lead to a massive mountain of debt. Okay, so if every country's problem is different, how in the world do we assess the risk? This brings us to a really key concept that economists use to figure out if a country can handle a crisis. It's called economic resilience. Now, resilience isn't just about having low debt, not at all. It's about having the fundamental strength to absorb a hit, like a global recession or a pandemic, and then having the capacity to fight back and actually engineer a recovery when those shocks inevitably happen. So how do you measure this resilience? Well, this strength is really built on a few key pillars. Economists will ask, can the country actually pay its foreign debts? Does the government have enough fiscal space, basically room in its budget, to act in a crisis? Or is it already maxed out? And is its central bank credible enough to manage the economy without completely panicking the markets? These are the questions that really, truly matter. All right, with that framework in mind, let's zoom back out and see what history can teach us from those 3 previous global waves of debt we talked about. Now, if you look at the first 3 waves, they were all different in terms of who was borrowing and where the hot spots were. But they all shared a very similar ending: a crisis. A crisis that was triggered by some big external shock that suddenly exposed all the vulnerabilities that had been building up under the surface for years. So, the big takeaway here is that surviving a debt wave isn't about luck. It's about making smart policy choices before the storm hits. Things like being transparent so everyone knows who owes what, properly regulating your financial sector, and having a solid plan to deal with bankruptcies when they happen. These are the boring but essential things that actually build resilience. And that leaves us with a final and pretty crucial thought. We know what causes these crises. The history books are basically a playbook on what to do and what not to do. The real test now is whether policymakers around the world have actually learned enough from the past to navigate the very dangerous waters ahead.